She was invisible, not because she was plain or unworthy of notice, but because the only man whose gaze she craved had never once turned her way. Lillian Ashworth, the Duchess of Thornwood, stood at the far end of a glittering ballroom in a gown of deep sapphire silk, watching her husband dance with another woman. The candlelight caught the gold thread in his dark hair and softened the severe lines of his face, a face she had memorized from countless stolen glances across silent dinner tables and cold, cavernous hallways. He smiled. It was a small, private curve of his lips, directed at the woman in his arms, Lady Clarissa Montfort. Something inside Lillian cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet internal fracture like ice giving way beneath a gentle weight. She had been the Duchess of Thornwood for 3 years. 3 years of polite distance, of silent longing, of hoping that someday he might look at her the way he was looking at Lady Clarissa now. She had believed patience would be rewarded. She had believed love could be earned through quiet devotion. She had believed so many foolish things. The music swirled through the ballroom, violins and cellos weaving a tapestry of sound that should have felt romantic, but instead felt suffocating. Lillian pressed her gloved fingers against the stem of her champagne glass and forced her lips to remain composed. A duchess did not cry in public. A duchess did not show weakness. She had learned that lesson within the first month of her marriage, when she had wept quietly in her chambers and Alexander had stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, before turning away without a word. "You are too pale, your grace. Shall I fetch you some air?" The voice belonged to Margaret, her lady's maid, who had materialized at her elbow with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to read her mistress's silences. Margaret was the closest thing Lillian had to a friend in Thornwood Manor, though even that relationship was bounded by the strict rules of propriety. "No, thank you, Margaret. I am perfectly well." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she had grown accustomed to bitter tastes. She had swallowed so many of them over the years. The dance ended. Alexander bowed to Lady Clarissa with that same small smile, and the young woman laughed, her cheeks flushed with pleasure, her golden curls bouncing with the movement. She was everything Lillian was not, vivacious where Lillian was reserved, openly warm where Lillian was guarded, the sort of woman who laughed easily and drew others into her orbit without effort. Lillian had never been that woman. She had been raised in a quiet household, the daughter of a baron whose fortunes had been modest and whose expectations had been even more so. She had never expected to marry a duke. She had certainly never expected to marry Alexander Ashworth, the most eligible and enigmatic man in the county. But her father had owed a debt, not a financial one, though those existed as well, but a debt of honor. Years ago, the old Duke of Thornwood had saved her father's life during a hunting accident, pulling him from a river before he drowned. When the old Duke had lain dying years later, he had extracted a promise from his son: marry the Baron's daughter, secure the alliance, honor the debt. Alexander, bound by duty as he had always been, had agreed. And so Lillian had become a duchess, and Alexander had become her husband, and 3 years had passed in which they had shared a name, a household, and absolutely nothing else. She had tried. In the beginning, she had tried so hard. She had learned his preferences for meals, the way he took his tea, the books he favored in his library. She had worn the colors he seemed to notice on other women. She had lingered in hallways hopping to encounter him, had arranged her schedule to match his, had filled Thornwood Manor with small gestures of care that he never seemed to see. She had loved him quietly, desperately, invisibly, and he had remained a stranger. Now, watching him escort Lady Clarissa toward the refreshment table, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, Lillian understood something she had been avoiding for a very long time. She understood that she could not continue like this. She understood that her love was not a gift but a burden, one that she alone carried. She understood that Alexander Ashworth would never love her, not because she was unworthy, but because he simply did not see her. She had become a piece of furniture in his life, a title rather than a person, a duty fulfilled rather than a wife cherished. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that she needed to stop hopping. The decision did not announce itself with drama. There were no tears, no grand resolutions shouted into empty rooms. Instead, something inside Lillian simply quieted. The desperate, aching part of her that had spent 3 years straining toward a man who would never reach back finally fell still. She looked at Alexander across the ballroom, at the handsome Duke who was her husband in name only, and she felt the first stirrings of something she had not felt in years. Freedom. Not the freedom to leave. A duchess could not simply walk away from her marriage, but the freedom to stop caring, the freedom to stop trying, the freedom to build a life for herself within the gilded cage she had been placed in. She set down her champagne glass with a soft click and turned away from the ballroom. Margaret followed, her footsteps silent on the marble floor. No one noticed the Duchess of Thornwood leave. No one ever did. The night air was cool against her skin as she stepped onto the terrace. Stars scattered across the sky like diamonds dropped carelessly onto black velvet. She breathed in deeply, filling her lungs with something other than candle smoke and perfume and the suffocating weight of unrequited love. Behind her, the music continued. Behind her, her husband smiled at another woman. Behind her, the life she had tried so desperately to build lay in quiet ruins. But ahead of her, there was possibility. She did not know what shape her new life would take. She only knew that she could no longer live as she had been living. She could no longer be the invisible duchess, the patient wife, the woman who waited. Something had to change. And since Alexander would not change, since he was incapable of seeing her as anything more than an obligation, the change would have to come from her. "Your Grace, are you unwell?" Margaret's voice was gentle, concerned. Lillian turned to find her maid hovering in the doorway, her kind face creased with worry. Margaret had been with her since the beginning, had witnessed every small heartbreak, every quiet rejection, every moment of hope that had withered into disappointment. If anyone understood what this night had cost her, it was Margaret. "I am well," Lillian said, and this time it was not entirely a lie. "I am better than I have been in a long time." Margaret's brow furrowed, clearly skeptical, but she did not question further. She simply nodded, as she always did, and stepped back to allow Lillian to pass. The Duchess walked through the corridors of Thornwood Manor, her sapphire gown whispering against the stone floors, and she felt the strange lightness of a woman who had finally released a burden she had been carrying for far too long. She did not go to Alexander's chambers that night. In the early days of their marriage, she had sometimes lingered in the hallway outside his door, hopping for an invitation that never came. Later, she had abandoned the practice, recognizing it as the desperate act it was. Now she walked past his door without pausing, without glancing, without feeling the familiar ache in her chest. The ache was still there, buried deep beneath layers of resignation, but it no longer controlled her. She would not allow it to control her. Her own chambers were cold. The fire had been lit, but it had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. Lillian dismissed Margaret with a quiet word of thanks and stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the trappings of a life that had never truly belonged to her. The grand bed with its velvet hangings. The dressing table cluttered with silver brushes and crystal perfume bottles. The wardrobe full of gowns she had chosen in hopes of catching her husband's eye. All of it felt like a costume, like props in a play she had been performing for 3 years without an audience. She crossed to the window and looked out at the estate grounds, silvered by moonlight. Thornwood was beautiful. Its rolling hills, its ancient forests, its carefully tended gardens, all of it was beautiful, and all of it was hers in name at least. She was the Duchess of Thornwood. She had power if she chose to wield it. She had resources if she chose to use them. She had spent 3 years being passive, waiting, hopping. Perhaps it was time to be something else. The thought felt foreign, almost dangerous. She had been raised to be agreeable, to be pleasing, to be the sort of woman who made a good wife. Her mother had taught her that a woman's greatest virtue was patience, that love would come if she was simply good enough, kind enough, accommodating enough. But her mother had been wrong. Patience had brought her nothing but 3 years of loneliness. Goodness had made her invisible. Kindness had been mistaken for weakness. She was done being weak. The next morning, Lillian rose early. She dressed simply, in a gown of dove-gray wool that required no assistance to fasten, and made her way to the estate office before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. The steward, a portly man named Mr. Collins who had served the Ashworth family for 3 decades, looked up in surprise when she entered. "Your Grace," he said, rising hastily from his chair and nearly upsetting his inkwell. "I was not expecting. Is something amiss?" "Nothing is amiss, Mr. Collins." Lillian took a seat across from his desk, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I wish to review the estate accounts." Mr. Collins blinked. In 3 years, the Duchess had never once asked to see the accounts. She had never shown any interest in the running of the estate. She had been, by all appearances, content to float through Thornwood Manor like a ghost, leaving no impression on anything or anyone. The steward's surprise was understandable, if somewhat insulting. "Of course, Your Grace," he said, recovering his composure. "Though I assure you His Grace reviews the accounts monthly, everything is in order." "I do not doubt your competence, Mr. Collins. I simply wish to understand the workings of my home." "My home." The words felt strange on her tongue, almost presumptuous, but they were true. Thornwood was her home, whether Alexander saw her as part of it or not. She had every right to understand its operations. Mr. Collins hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented request. But the Duchess's expression was calm and expectant, and after a moment, he nodded and began pulling ledgers from the shelves. Lillian settled into her chair and prepared to learn. She spent the morning poring over columns of numbers, asking questions that grew increasingly pointed as her understanding deepened. Mr. Collins, initially reluctant, soon warmed to the task, clearly pleased to have someone take an interest in his work. By midday, Lillian had identified 3 areas where the estate's resources could be better allocated, and 4 tenants whose rents might be reduced to ease their burdens during a difficult harvest season. "Has His Grace been informed of the Cooper family's situation?" she asked, tapping a finger against an entry that recorded the family's arrears. Mr. Collins shifted uncomfortably. "His Grace has been occupied with other matters. I mentioned it briefly, but he did not provide instruction." Lillian nodded, unsurprised. Alexander's neglect extended beyond his wife to the very people who depended on him. The Coopers had been tenants of Thornwood for generations. Their eldest son had been injured in a farming accident the previous spring, and the family had fallen behind on their rent while paying for his medical care. It was an injustice, plain and simple. "Reduce their rent by half for the remainder of the year," Lillian said, "and arrange for a physician to visit their son weekly until he is recovered. The estate will cover the cost." Mr. Collins's eyebrows rose, but he did not argue. "Yes, Your Grace." She spent the afternoon visiting the tenants, introducing herself to families she should have met years ago. Some regarded her with suspicion, clearly wondering why the Duchess had suddenly taken an interest in their lives after 3 years of silence. Others welcomed her with open relief, grateful that someone at the great house was finally paying attention. Lillian listened to their concerns, noted their needs, and promised nothing she could not deliver. She was careful, methodical, deliberate. She would not make promises she could not keep. She would not offer hope only to disappoint. She had learned that lesson well enough. By the time she returned to the manor, the sun was sinking low in the sky, painting the stone walls in shades of amber and rose. She was tired, her feet aching from hours of walking through muddy fields and rutted lanes, but it was a good tired, a productive tired, a tired that came from doing something meaningful rather than simply existing. She was climbing the main staircase when she heard it, voices from the drawing room. One of them was Alexander's, low and warm in a way she recognized but had never been the recipient of. The other was Lady Clarissa's, bright and musical. So kind of you to invite me to stay, Your Grace. Thornwood is simply magnificent. I cannot imagine ever wanting to leave." Lillian stopped mid-step, her hand resting on the polished banister. Lady Clarissa was staying at Thornwood. Alexander had invited her to stay, without consulting his wife, without even informing her. The disrespect was so complete, so casual, that it took her breath away. For a moment the old pain surged up, hot and sharp and demanding. How dare he? How dare he bring that woman into their home, parade her through the halls where Lillian was supposed to be mistress, treat her with a warmth he had never once shown his own wife? The injustice of it was staggering. But then, just as quickly as it had risen, the pain subsided. It receded like a wave pulling back from the shore, leaving behind something harder and more durable: resolve. She had spent 3 years being wounded by Alexander's indifference. She would not spend another day. If he wished to entertain Lady Clarissa, let him. She would not stand in his way. She would not beg for his attention. She would not compete for a love that had never been offered. She continued up the stairs, her footsteps steady, her expression calm. She did not pause at the drawing-room door. She did not announce her presence. She simply walked past, as invisible as she had always been, and for the first time the invisibility felt like armor rather than a wound. The following days passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. Lillian rose early each morning, ate breakfast alone in the small morning room she had claimed as her own, and spent the daylight hours attending to estate business. She visited tenants, reviewed accounts, consulted with Mr. Collins about crop rotations and drainage systems, and the 100 other small details that kept an estate like Thornwood functioning. She did not seek out Alexander's company, and he did not seek hers. They moved through the manor like ships passing in fog, aware of each other's presence but never quite connecting. Lady Clarissa, for her part, seemed perfectly content to occupy the Duke's attention. Her laughter echoed through the corridors at all hours. Her perfume lingered in the drawing-room long after she had retired for the night. She was beautiful and charming and clearly enchanted by Alexander, and the servants whispered that it was only a matter of time before the Duke made an announcement regarding his intentions toward her. Let them whisper, Lillian thought. Let them speculate. She had more important matters to attend to. It was on the 5th day after the ball that something shifted. Lillian was returning from a visit to the village, where she had arranged for the schoolhouse roof to be repaired, when she encountered Alexander in the entrance hall. He was dressed for riding, his boots polished to a mirror shine, his coat fitting perfectly across his broad shoulders. He looked, as he always did, like a figure from a painting, beautiful, remote, utterly unapproachable. "Your Grace," he said, inclining his head in that formal way he had, as if she were a distant acquaintance rather than his wife. "Your Grace," she replied, matching his tone exactly. Once she would have lingered, hopping for more conversation. Once she would have searched his face for some sign of warmth, some flicker of the affection she so desperately craved. Now she simply walked past him toward the staircase. "Lillian." The sound of her name stopped her cold. He never called her by name. She was always Your Grace, or, on rare occasions, Duchess. Never Lillian, never anything personal or intimate or warm. She turned slowly, keeping her expression carefully neutral. "Yes." Alexander stood in the center of the entrance hall, one hand resting on his riding crop, his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not quite read. He seemed almost uncertain. It was such an unfamiliar look on him that she wondered if she was imagining it. "I understand you have been visiting the tenants," he said. "Yes, I have." "And reviewing the accounts." "Yes." "And arranging for repairs at the schoolhouse." "Yes." A beat of silence. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You did not consult me." It was not a question, but Lillian treated it as one. "I did not realize I was required to. As Duchess, I have certain responsibilities toward the estate and its people. I am simply fulfilling them. Responsibilities that I have managed perfectly well on my own for years." Have you? The word slipped out before she could stop it, quiet but pointed. She saw the flash of surprise in his eyes, quickly suppressed. In 3 years she had never contradicted him. She had never challenged him. She had been agreeable, accommodating, invisible. But she was no longer invisible, and she was no longer willing to be agreeable at the expense of truth. The Cooper's son was injured last spring, she continued, her voice steady. They have been falling behind on their rent while paying for his care. Mrs. Hastings in the East Cottage has been living with a leaking roof since autumn. The village schoolhouse has been in disrepair for nearly 2 years. These are not matters that have been managed, Your Grace. They are matters that have been neglected. Alexander's expression hardened. You presume to lecture me on the management of my own estate. Not lecture, inform, there is a difference. The air between them crackled with tension. Lillian could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she did not look away. She did not apologize. She did not retreat. She had spent 3 years retreating, and she was done. I have been busy, Alexander said finally, his voice clipped. I cannot attend to every minor matter personally. No, Lillian agreed, which is precisely why I am attending to them. You are welcome, Your Grace. She turned and continued up the stairs, her back straight, her head high. She could feel his gaze on her, could feel the weight of his stare like a physical pressure between her shoulder blades. She did not turn around. She did not falter. She climbed the stairs to her chambers, closed the door behind her, and only then allowed herself to exhale. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them against her skirts to still them, her heart racing from the confrontation. She had never spoken to Alexander that way before. She had never spoken to anyone that way before. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely, utterly necessary. The days that followed brought a subtle change in the atmosphere of Thornwood Manor. Alexander was still distant, still formal, but there was something different in the way he looked at her now. A flicker of something behind those dark eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or confusion. He was accustomed to a wife who was quiet and agreeable, who never challenged him, who existed only in the spaces he allowed. This new Lillian, the one who spoke her mind and managed his estate and did not wilt under his disapproval, was an unknown quantity. And Alexander Ashworth did not like unknowns. Lady Clarissa remained at the manor, though her presence had become less prominent. Lillian suspected that Alexander had been spending less time with her, though she could not be certain and did not particularly care. She had stopped tracking her husband's movements. She had stopped wondering where he was and who he was with and whether he might think of her at all. The freedom of that release was extraordinary. It was like setting down a weight she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten it was there. On the 8th day, something unexpected happened. Lillian was in the village, speaking with the school teacher about the repairs that had been completed, when a young man approached her. He was tall and fair-haired, with a friendly face and an easy smile, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being liked. Your Grace, he said, bowing with a flourish that was almost playful. Forgive the intrusion. I am James Ashford, Lord Ashford's youngest son. I believe we met briefly at your wedding, though I doubt you would remember me. You had rather a lot on your mind that day. Lillian did remember him, vaguely. He had been one of the many guests at the wedding, a distant cousin of Alexander's with a reputation for charm and a notable lack of interest in settling down. He had smiled at her during the ceremony, she recalled. A kind smile, offered to a nervous bride who had looked like she might faint at any moment. Mr. Ashford, she said, inclining her head, what brings you to Thornwood? I am visiting my aunt in the next county and thought I might pay my respects to the Duke and Duchess. He paused, his smile widening slightly. Though I confess, when I arrived at the manor I was told you were here, and I found myself curious. Curious? About the Duchess who spends her days visiting tenants and repairing schoolhouses rather than hosting teas and arranging flower displays. He tilted his head, studying her with open interest. You are not quite what I expected. Lillian felt a flush rise to her cheeks, though she could not have said why. There was nothing improper in his words, nothing overtly forward in his manner. But the way he looked at her, it was the way a man looked at a woman he found interesting. It was a look she had never received from her own husband. "I am simply doing my duty, Mr. Ashford." Most duchesses define their duty rather differently. He offered her his arm. "Would you allow me to escort you back to the manor? It is a fine afternoon, and I would be grateful for the company." She hesitated. Accepting his arm would be perfectly proper. He was a relative, after all, and a gentleman known to the family. But something about the invitation felt charged, as if it carried more weight than a simple walk. Still, refusing would seem strange, even rude, and James Ashford had been nothing but polite. "Very well," she said, placing her hand lightly on his arm. "Thank you." They walked through the village together, past the repaired schoolhouse and the small stone church, and the cluster of cottages that housed the estate's tenants. James proved to be an engaging companion, full of stories about his travels and his family and the various scrapes he had gotten into as a young man. He asked her questions about the estate work she had been doing, and unlike Alexander, he actually listened to her answers. He seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. "You are not what I expected at all, Your Grace," he said again as they approached the manor gates. "I was told you were, forgive me, rather retiring, quiet, the sort of Duchess one hardly notices." Lillian laughed, a sound that surprised her with its genuineness. "That is precisely the sort of Duchess I have been, until recently." "And what changed?" She considered the question, watching the afternoon light filter through the trees that lined the drive. What had changed? Everything and nothing. The same ballroom, the same husband, the same indifference. But something inside her had shifted, a door closing, a window opening, a decision made in the quiet aftermath of humiliation. "I realized I was waiting for something that was never going to come," she said quietly. "So I stopped waiting." James was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, without the playful edge it had carried before. "My cousin is a fool." Lillian did not reply. She could not. To agree would be disloyal. To disagree would be dishonest. She simply kept walking, her hand still resting on James Ashford's arm until they reached the manor doors. Alexander was standing in the entrance hall when they entered. He was still in his riding clothes, his hair windswept, his boots dusty from the road. He had clearly just returned from somewhere, and he had clearly seen them through the window, seen his wife walking up the drive on his cousin's arm, laughing at something his cousin had said, looking happier than she had looked in 3 years of marriage. The expression on his face was one Lillian had never seen before. It took her a moment to recognize it. When she did, she felt a strange, unexpected flicker of satisfaction. It was jealousy. "Ashford," Alexander said, his voice perfectly controlled, "I was not informed you were visiting." "I decided at the last moment," James replied easily, apparently unbothered by the Duke's chilly reception. "I hope I am not imposing." "Not at all." Alexander's gaze moved to Lillian, and something flickered in his eyes, something dark and possessive and utterly unfamiliar. "I trust my wife has been entertaining you adequately." "Your wife has been delightful," James said, and there was just enough warmth in his voice to make the words a subtle challenge. "You are a fortunate man, Ashworth." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Lillian stood between the two men, acutely aware of the tension crackling through the air. This was new territory. She had never been the object of any man's jealousy, least of all her husband's. She did not quite know what to do with it. "If you will excuse me," she said, slipping her hand from James's arm, "I have correspondence to attend to." She did not wait for a response. She walked calmly up the stairs, her footsteps measured, her expression serene. But her heart was beating faster than it had in months, and her mind was spinning with questions she could not answer. Why did Alexander care? Why now, after 3 years of indifference? Was it simply possessiveness, the the natural reaction of a man who saw something he considered his being admired by another, or was it something more? She did not know, and what was more surprising, she did not know if she cared. The days that followed were strange and strained. James Ashford extended his visit, much to Alexander's visible displeasure, and Lillian found herself spending more time with him than she probably should have. They walked together in the gardens, rode together through the estate, sat together in the drawing room while Alexander glowered from the corner. James was funny and kind and attentive in a way that Alexander had never been, and Lillian would have been lying if she said she did not enjoy his company. But she was not foolish enough to mistake enjoyment for something more. James Ashford was a distraction, a pleasant companion who made her feel seen and heard and valued. He was not a future. He could never be. She was married, and she took her vows seriously, even if her husband did not. She would not dishonor herself or her position by engaging in anything improper, but she would not apologize for having a friend either. Alexander, however, seemed increasingly unable to tolerate the situation. He had stopped spending time with Lady Clarissa, who had departed the manor rather abruptly one morning with red-rimmed eyes and a tight smile. The servants whispered that the Duke had informed her, quite coldly, that he had no intention of marrying again, and that her continued presence at Thornwood was no longer appropriate. Lillian pretended not to hear the whispers, but she could not deny the small, shameful thrill of satisfaction they gave her. It was on the 14th day after the ball that everything came to a head. Lillian was in the estate office, reviewing the latest accounts with Mr. Collins when the door opened and Alexander strode in. His expression was thunderous, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with an emotion she had never seen in him before. He was angry, truly, deeply angry. "Leave us," he said to Mr. Collins, who scrambled from the room with impressive speed. Lillian remained seated, her hands folded on the desk before her. She felt calm, strangely calm, as if she had been waiting for this confrontation and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. "May I help you, Your Grace?" "You may explain to me," Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous. "Why, I've just learned from my steward that my wife has been managing the estate for nearly a fortnight without my knowledge or consent. Why my tenants speak of the Duchess as if she were the mistress of Thornwood in truth, while I am apparently nothing more than a figurehead. Why my cousin has extended his visit for reasons that have nothing to do with family obligation and everything to do with you." Lillian met his gaze steadily. "I have been managing the estate because the estate needed managing. I did not seek your consent because you were occupied with other matters and could not be bothered to attend to your responsibilities. The tenants speak of me because I am the only one who has spoken to them. And as for your cousin, you would have to ask him why he has chosen to extend his visit. I am not responsible for his decisions. You have been spending time with him. I have been polite to a member of your family who has shown me kindness and respect. If that displeases you, I apologize. But I will not be rude to a guest simply because you find his presence inconvenient." Alexander took a step closer, his hands braced on the edge of the desk. "He looks at you." The words were almost accusatory, as if James's attention were somehow her fault. Lillian felt a spark of anger kindle in her chest. How dare he? How dare he ignore her for 3 years, parade another woman through their home, and then act as if he had any claim to her loyalty? "And how is that my concern?" she asked quietly. "I do not control where men look. I have never been able to control where anyone looks, including my husband." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Alexander flinched, actually flinched as if she had struck him. For a long moment he simply stared at her, his expression shifting through a complex series of emotions that she could not fully read. Surprise, confusion, and beneath it all, something that looked almost like pain. "Lillian," he said, and his voice was different now, quieter, almost hesitant. "I did not realize." "No," she agreed. "You did not. You have never realized. You have never seen me at all." She rose from her chair, her movements deliberate, her gaze unwavering. She was no longer afraid of him. She was no longer afraid of his disapproval or his distance or his cold, impenetrable silences. She had spent 3 years being afraid, and she was done. "I loved you," she said, and her voice was steady even as her heart cracked open inside her chest. "From the moment we married, I loved you. I tried everything I could think of to make you notice me. I learned your preferences. I arranged my life around yours. I waited in hallways and lingered at dinner tables and hoped every single day that you might look at me the way a husband looks at a wife. But you never did. You looked through me. You looked past me. You treated me as if I were a piece of furniture, a duty to be tolerated rather than a person to be cherished. And I accepted it for 3 years because I thought that if I was patient enough, good enough, loving enough, you would eventually see me. But you never did." Her voice cracked on the last word and she paused, drawing a shaky breath. Alexander was staring at her, his face pale, his hands still braced on the desk as if he needed the support to remain standing. "So I stopped," she continued, quieter now. "I stopped hopping. I stopped waiting. I stopped loving you, or at least I am trying to stop. And now when I have finally found something that gives my life meaning, work that matters, people who need me, a purpose beyond being your invisible wife, now you decide to notice me. Now you decide to care. And I do not know what to do with that, Alexander. I do not know if I can trust it. I do not know if I want to." The silence that followed was absolute. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the hour. Somewhere outside, birds sang in the afternoon sunlight. But here, in this room, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, standing on opposite sides of a desk that felt like a chasm. Alexander straightened slowly. His face was still pale, his eyes still dark with some emotion she could not name. When he spoke, his voice was rough, almost raw. "I did not know," he said. "Lillian, I swear to you I did not know." "Did not know what? That I loved you, that I was waiting for you, that I was drowning in loneliness while you smiled at other women. That you felt any of it." He stepped around the desk, closing the distance between them. She did not retreat, though every instinct told her to protect herself, to put space between them, to guard what was left of her heart. "I thought you were content. I thought the arrangement suited you as well as it suited me. I did not realize you wanted more." "How could you not realize?" The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with the bitterness of 3 years of silence. "I was your wife. I was living in your home, sharing your name, trying every day to reach you. How could you not see?" "Because I was not looking." The admission seemed to cost him something. His voice was barely above a whisper now, and his eyes, those dark, guarded eyes that had never once softened for her, were bright with something that looked terrifyingly like tears. "I was not looking because I was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean if I let myself care for you. Afraid of losing control, of being vulnerable, of becoming like my father." "Your father?" Alexander turned away, his shoulders rigid with tension. "My father loved my mother. Desperately, completely, without reservation. And when she died, he was destroyed. He spent the rest of his life as a ghost, going through the motions of living without ever truly being alive. I swore I would never let that happen to me. I swore I would never love anyone enough to be broken by their loss." Lillian stared at his back, her mind reeling. In 3 years of marriage, he had never spoken of his parents. She had known, of course, that his mother had died when he was young, that his father had been distant and cold in the years that followed. But she had never understood the reason. She had never imagined that the coldness was born from grief, that the distance was a shield rather than a weapon. "And so you closed yourself off," she said slowly. "You built walls so high that no one could reach you. You pushed me away before I could get close enough to hurt you." "I did not realize I was pushing you away, I thought." He turned back to face her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before. Open, vulnerable, terrified. "I thought you were simply doing your duty as I was doing mine. I did not realize you wanted more. I did not realize you were waiting for me." I waited for 3 years, Alexander. 3 years of silence and distance and watching you smile at other women while you never once smiled at me. Do you have any idea what that was like? Do you have any idea how invisible I felt?" He flinched again as if her words were physical blows. "I am sorry. I know that is not enough. I know those words cannot undo the years of neglect. But I am sorry, Lillian, truly. I have been blind and foolish and cruel without intending to be, and I have hurt you in ways I cannot begin to understand." She wanted to believe him. Part of her desperately wanted to fall into his arms and accept his apology and let herself hope again. But she had hoped before, and hope had burned her. She could not simply forget 3 years of loneliness because he had finally decided to notice her. "I do not know if I can trust this," she said quietly. "I do not know if I can trust you. You ignored me for 3 years, and now that someone else has shown me kindness, now that you see me as something that might be taken away, suddenly you care. How do I know this is not simply jealousy? How do I know it will last?" "I do not know how to prove it to you." Alexander's voice was rough, almost broken. "I do not know how to undo the years of silence, but I will try. I will spend the rest of my life trying if you will let me. I will learn to see you. I will learn to be the husband you deserved from the beginning. I will tear down every wall I have built and let you in if you are willing to give me the chance." Lillian looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had always wanted him to look at her. She saw the fear in his eyes, the hope, the desperate, aching vulnerability of a man who had finally realized what he stood to lose. She saw the cracks in his armor, the places where the ice had begun to melt. She saw, for the first time, not the cold, distant Duke she had married, but the man beneath. A man who had been just as lonely as she was, just as afraid, just as trapped in a prison of his own making. She took a step toward him, then another. She lifted her hand and pressed it gently against his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin, the slight tremor that ran through him at her touch. He closed his eyes, and a shuddering breath escaped his lips. "I loved you too late," he whispered, "but I love you now." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and new and terrifying. Lillian felt tears prick at her eyes, tears she had been holding back for 3 years, tears of loneliness and heartbreak and, yes, hope. Hope that she had thought was dead, but that was stirring now, flickering back to life like a candle in the darkness. "Then prove it," she said softly. "Not with words, with time, with patience, with the kind of love I tried to give you for 3 years. Prove to me that this is real and I will try to trust it. I will try to trust you." Alexander opened his eyes. He reached up and covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his cheek. "I will," he said. "I swear it." And for the first time in their marriage, Lillian believed him. The weeks that followed were not easy. Old habits were hard to break, and 3 years of distance could not be erased overnight. There were still moments of silence between them, still moments when Lillian caught herself retreating into the safe shell she had built, still moments when Alexander's old coldness flickered back before he caught himself and softened. But there were also new moments, tentative, fragile, precious moments, that slowly began to stitch the wounds between them. Alexander began joining her on her visits to the tenants. At first he was awkward, uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with the unfamiliar role of attentive landlord. But Lillian guided him gently, showing him the families she had come to know, the problems she had been working to solve, the small victories that made the work worthwhile. He listened. He learned. He began to care, not just because she cared, but because he was finally allowing himself to see the people who depended on him. They took meals together now, in the small morning room rather than the grand dining hall. The conversation was still cautious at times, still searching for its footing, but it was conversation. Real conversation, of the sort they had never had before. Alexander asked her about her day. He told her about his. He shared memories of his mother, painful ones that made his voice go tight. He let her see the cracks in his armor, the places where he was not the cold, perfect Duke, but simply a man who had been afraid for a very long time. James Ashford departed after a week, having realized, with more grace than Lillian had expected, that his presence was no longer welcome. He bid her farewell with a kiss on the hand and a knowing smile. "If he hurts you again," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear, "you know where to find me." But there was no expectation in his voice, no real hope. He knew, as she did, that her heart had already made its choice. The turning point came on an evening in late autumn, nearly 2 months after the ball that had changed everything. Lillian was sitting in the library, reading by the fire, when Alexander entered. He looked tired, his hair disheveled, his cravat loosened. He had been in meetings all day with his solicitor, dealing with some complicated matter of estate law that had kept him occupied for weeks. He crossed the room without speaking and lowered himself into the chair beside hers. For a long moment, he simply sat there, staring into the fire, his profile limned in gold. Then he reached out and took her hand. "I have been thinking," he said quietly, "about what you said, about waiting for something that never came." Lillian's heart clenched. They had not spoken of that night since their confrontation in the estate office. It had hovered between them, an unspoken shadow, but neither had been willing to revisit it directly. "I do not want you to wait any more," Alexander continued. "I do not want you to ever feel invisible again, so I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "All right." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "What do you want? Not what you think you should want, not what duty or propriety demands. What do you want, Lillian, for yourself?" The question caught her off guard. In 3 years of marriage, no one had ever asked her that. Her wants had always been secondary, to her father's needs, to her husband's preferences, to the demands of her position. She had spent so long suppressing her own desires that she had almost forgotten they existed. "I want to be useful," she said slowly. "I want the work I have been doing with the tenants to matter. I want to help people. I want to be more than a title, more than an ornament, more than the invisible woman I used to be." Alexander nodded, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Then you shall have it, all of it. The estate work, the tenants, the schoolhouses, whatever you want to do, I will support it. I will support you. Not because it is your duty, but because it is your right. You are the Duchess of Thornwood, and this estate is as much yours as it is mine." Lillian felt tears prick at her eyes. It was such a simple thing, really. The acknowledgement that she had value, that her work mattered, that she was more than a decorative accessory to her husband's life. But it meant more to her than any grand gesture could have. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "No," he said. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for being patient when I did not deserve it, for teaching me how to love even when I was too afraid to learn." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind stirred the last of the autumn leaves, sending them skittering across the grounds. But inside, in the warm glow of the library, two people who had been strangers for 3 years sat together in silence. Their hands intertwined, their hearts slowly, tentatively, finding their way toward each other. It was not a fairy tale. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping romantic gestures, no sudden transformations that erased years of pain. There was only the quiet, patient work of healing, the slow rebuilding of trust, the gradual discovery of a love that had been buried beneath layers of fear and silence, waiting to be unearthed. And as the weeks turned to months and the months began to stretch toward a year, Lillian found that she was no longer invisible. She was seen, truly seen, by the one person whose gaze she had always craved. Alexander looked at her now the way she had once dreamed of being looked at, not with possession or obligation or distant courtesy, but with warmth, with admiration, with love. It had taken him 3 years to see her. It had taken her 3 years to stop waiting. But somewhere along the way, in the space between heartbreak and hope, they had found each other. And that, Lillian thought, was worth every moment of the waiting. One evening, as they walked together through the gardens in the soft light of sunset, Alexander paused. He turned to face her, his expression serious but his eyes soft, and took both her hands in his. "I have something to tell you," he said, "something I should have told you a long time ago." Lillian's heart fluttered, but she kept her voice steady. "What is it?" "When I married you, I thought I was fulfilling a duty. I thought I was honoring my father's dying wish and nothing more, but I was wrong." He squeezed her hands gently. "You were never a duty, Lillian. You were a gift. A gift I was too blind to see, too afraid to accept, too foolish to treasure. But I see it now. I see you now. And I will spend every day of the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its evening song. And Lillian Ashworth, the Duchess of Thornwood, smiled. A real smile, full and warm and unguarded, for the first time in 3 years. "You already are," she said. And she meant it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next amazing story.